On Christmas Eve, my husband's mother told me I wasn't worthy to sit at the family table because I couldn't give them a child. What none of them knew was that the man they defended, the one who divorced me for being infertile, had a medical report I never threw away. Stay with me, because the moment I exposed his secret, in front of everyone who once humiliated me, was the moment I took my life back. Emily Carter had once believed in quiet love. The kind that didn't need grand gestures or loud declarations, just two people building a life together, day by day. She had imagined morning coffees shared in silence, the soft brushing of hands while passing dishes, the warmth of a home made not of luxury, but of presence. But that wasn't the life she ended up living. At 28, Emily's days bled together in a rhythm so monotonous it had no edges. Wake up before dawn. Start the coffee. Fold the laundry that no one noticed being cleaned. Grocery lists, meal plans, vacuum lines in the carpet. Proof of her existence left only in temporary lines and the smell of lemon-scented cleaner. She had been married to Daniel Carter for 3 years. On paper, their life looked perfect. He was a young CEO of a booming tech firm. She was the supportive wife who'd put her budding music career on hold to build something real. People envied her. "You don't have to work? Must be nice," they'd say with tight smiles. But no one saw how deeply invisible Emily had become in her own life. The silence at home was the worst part. It wasn't angry or violent. It was indifferent. Daniel would leave early, usually before she woke up. When he returned, his eyes would flick across her like skimming a newspaper, only glancing at the headlines, never reading the details. They barely spoke beyond logistical exchanges. "What's for dinner? Did you pay the landscaper? Don't forget my dry cleaning." They had once dreamed together. Emily remembered the way Daniel used to hold her face in both hands, saying, "I want to give you a life that feels like music."
Now.
She was lucky if he looked up from his phone when she walked into the room. But the weight of her sadness didn't come from the absence of romance. It came from the presence of contempt. Daniel's parents had never liked her. She wasn't ambitious enough, they whispered, never outright rude, but always with a layer of disapproval too thick to ignore. And after 3 years of marriage with no child, their passive-aggressive remarks had grown crueler. "You're feeding him all those healthy meals. But maybe it's time to feed him some fertility vitamins too, dear," his mother once said at a family brunch, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Daniel didn't speak up. Because the truth? Emily wasn't the problem. Daniel had been diagnosed with infertility 2 years into their marriage. It was a quiet appointment at a private clinic, and he had asked her not to tell anyone. "This will destroy my image," he had said, his voice sharp and defensive. Emily had nodded. Of course, she wouldn't tell. She loved him. She still did. In a quiet, distant way. The kind of love that starts to turn into grief before you realize it. Since then, she had carried the blame in silence. The looks, the judgments, the pitted glances from family friends. Her own mother had gently asked, "Have you thought about seeing a specialist?" Emily had smiled.
Leet.
Said they were trying. But trying looked like Daniel spending less and less time at home. Like dinners eaten alone. Like her body being discussed like a defective machine by people who didn't know the truth, and never would, because she had decided to protect him. Even if it meant being the villain in everyone else's story. Worst of all, Daniel began to believe it too. He never outright said it, but his behavior changed. He started giving her money, like allowances. Started asking why she hadn't done something with her time. Maybe take a class, he once offered, scrolling through his phone, or volunteer. Something productive. As if she'd done nothing all these years. As if building a home, being present, keeping faith in their vows wasn't work worth doing. Sometimes, Emily wondered if she had lost herself slowly, or if she had simply handed herself over piece by piece in the name of love, until there was nothing left to call hers. She didn't even sing anymore. Music had once been the center of her world. She'd been accepted into a music conservatory after high school, studied voice, even wrote her own songs. But after marrying Daniel, she had let it go. "We'll be busy with a family soon," she had told herself. There will be time later. Now, the piano in the corner of the living room was covered in dust, unused, like a relic of someone else's life. And in a way, it was. Because somewhere between the laundry loads and the polite silences, Emily Carter had become a woman no one noticed. Not even the man she married. But something inside her had begun to stir again, not out of anger, not yet, but out of an ache too persistent to ignore. And that ache was starting to hum. The snow had begun falling early that Christmas Eve, soft and silent like the hush before a confession. Emily watched it through the kitchen window, steam from the boiling pot curling around her face like a fog. The house was full of noise, laughter, clinking glasses, the distant hum of carols from the living room speaker, but the kitchen was hers alone. Always was. She'd started cooking at 7 a.m. Daniel's family had traditions, rigid and extravagant ones. Every year, they held Christmas dinner at the Carter estate, his parents' sprawling home just outside of Westchester. Emily had offered, as always, to prepare the meal. Not out of duty, but out of hope. Maybe this time, if everything was perfect, someone would look her in the eyes and see her. By 6 p.m., she had cooked 2 roast turkeys, mashed potatoes whipped to velvet, homemade cranberry sauce, pecan pie from scratch, and an entire tray of butternut squash ravioli, Daniel's favorite. Her hands ached, her back screamed, her heart was quiet. As she carried the last tray into the dining room, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. She wore a faded apron smeared with sauce, her hair tied in a messy bun, a trace of flour on her cheek. She looked like the help. But that was the moment Daniel's mother, Victoria Carter, stepped in from the foyer, draped in red velvet and diamonds. "Oh, Emily, there you are," Victoria said with a faux cheer. "The wine glasses haven't been filled yet, and the children need their napkins folded into reindeer again. You remember how to do that, don't you?" Yes. I'll take care of it," Emily murmured. She turned back toward the kitchen, but not before catching the sharp look Victoria exchanged with her sister-in-law, who whispered something behind a manicured hand. They laughed. Dinner was served at 7:30 sharp. 14 guests. Daniel's family and their extended circle of corporate connections, investors, board members, people who still referred to Emily as Daniel's little homemaker. Everyone gathered around the long mahogany table, glistening with gold-rimmed plates and crystal stemware. Emily refilled wine glasses, adjusted settings, lit the final candle in the centerpiece. Then she took a breath and moved to sit at the far end of the table, between the children. But before she could pull out her chair, Victoria's voice sliced through the clatter. "Oh, Emily dear, that seat's not for you." The room went quiet. Someone chuckled nervously. Daniel didn't look up. "I just thought since you've been in the kitchen all day, you might prefer to eat there," Victoria said, smiling tightly. "You know, like you always do. Less pressure." Emily stood frozen, her hand still resting on the back of the chair. "I made this dinner," she said quietly, unsure if her voice would hold. "Yes, and we're all so grateful," Victoria said. "But this is a family table, and we're discussing business tonight, company projections, partnerships. You'd be bored." Bored. She looked to Daniel, her husband, her partner, her once best friend. He raised his wine glass and took a long sip, eyes fixed on his father. Something cracked, softly, invisibly, inside her. She didn't sit, didn't speak, just turned and walked back to the kitchen, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rug. She plated a small serving for herself and sat at the breakfast counter alone. From the kitchen, she could still hear laughter, forks against china, the clinking of crystal toasts. No one came to check on her. For a moment, she stared at her reflection in the oven door. The pale woman looking back didn't look sad. She looked empty. And that, somehow, was worse. Later that night, as she washed the dishes, her hands raw from soap, arms trembling from exhaustion, Daniel came into the kitchen, loosening his tie. "Everything turned out great," he said flatly, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. Emily dried her hands. "You didn't say anything when your mother told me I wasn't family." He shrugged. You know how she gets. She didn't mean anything by it. Yes, she did, Emily replied, her voice low.
He didn't argue.
Just said, don't make a big deal out of nothing. It was a dinner. And then he left her there, with half-washed wine glasses and a sinking heart. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a declaration. And for the first time, Emily realized she had become exactly what they all saw her as. Someone who cooked, served, stayed quiet, and didn't belong. That night, she sat on the edge of the guest room bed, because their bedroom had been converted into his office months ago, and stared at her suitcase. It hadn't been touched in years. But her fingers moved instinctively to the zipper. She wasn't ready to leave yet. But for the first time, she was thinking about it. And that, she knew, was the beginning of the end. The next morning, the house was quiet again. Not the kind of peaceful quiet Emily used to cherish. This was the kind that made your ears ring. The kind that sounded like the aftermath of something breaking. Even though no one had heard it fall. She stood in the hallway outside the dining room, looking at the remnants of the night before, lipstick-stained wine glasses, crumpled linen napkins. Scraps of turkey left cold on untouched plates. It looked like a battlefield where the only casualty had been her dignity. Her hands trembled as she gathered the plates, stacking them slowly. One by one. Every scrape of porcelain against porcelain felt like a scream. Daniel hadn't said goodnight. He hadn't followed her when she left the kitchen. Hadn't checked on her. Hadn't apologized. Hadn't even looked ashamed. He'd gone up to bed alone, like she was just a staff member cleaning up after a party. Emily had always believed that marriages didn't fall apart all at once. They dissolved slowly, like sugar in warm tea. But now she wondered if that was just something people told themselves to avoid admitting the truth. Because the truth was, hers had ended last night. It ended the moment he chose silence over solidarity. It ended when she realized he would rather keep her invisible than risk disrupting the perfect image of his family. For the rest of the day, no one mentioned the scene at dinner. Daniel's mother smiled tightly at her over breakfast, complimenting her pie. Daniel's father asked if she had considered starting a baking blog since she had so much free time. Emily nodded, answered politely. She even helped clean up again, because it was easier to move her hands than to let her mind think. But inside, she was screaming. Not loudly. Not angrily. It was the kind of scream that stayed behind your ribs, that came out as silence. The kind that stayed with you long after the room emptied. That night, as they drove back home, Daniel hummed along to the radio. Emily stared out the window. Snowflakes hit the windshield and melted instantly, leaving behind trails of water, like tiny failures. Like her. He parked in the driveway, turned off the ignition, and reached for his phone before even stepping out. We should send a thank you card to my parents, he mumbled. They put a lot into that dinner. Emily opened the door without responding. Once inside, she went straight to the bedroom, his bedroom. The one she hadn't slept in for weeks. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the oak cabinet and retrieved a plain white envelope that had been sitting there for months. It was the envelope the fertility specialist had given her. The one with Daniel's diagnosis, carefully folded, unspoken. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. She had carried his secret like a stone in her chest. Protected him. Absorbed the cruel words, the passive-aggressive remarks, the sideways glances, because she thought love was sacrifice. Because she thought protecting him meant protecting them. But them didn't exist anymore. She placed the envelope on the nightstand, then went to the office, formerly their shared bedroom, and opened her laptop. Her fingers hesitated for just a moment before typing. Printable divorce papers, New York. The website loaded slowly, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Emily stared at the screen. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the darkened corner, just behind the monitor. Her face looked blank. Not angry, not even sad.
Just done.
She filled in the details.
Name. Date.
No children. No assets claimed. She checked the box. No contest. No fight.
No questions.
No war. Just truth.
Just the end.
She printed the papers quietly, like she was printing a recipe. Then she walked to the kitchen, placed them in a manila folder, and left them on the kitchen counter where Daniel usually placed his coffee cup. She didn't leave a note. The silence would say enough. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't throw anything. She didn't scroll through old photos or search for someone to blame. She just sat on the floor of the guest room, hugging her knees, listening to the radiator click and hiss. She slept without dreaming. The next morning, Daniel didn't say anything when he saw the envelope.
He didn't ask.
He didn't protest. He just poured his coffee, glanced at the paperwork, and walked out the door like it was any other Tuesday. And that, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't hate that ended them. It wasn't betrayal or a secret affair or some dramatic fight.
It was apathy.
Quiet, slow, soul-crushing apathy. And now, Emily Carter was alone. But for the first time in years, she realized that didn't have to be a bad thing. The final sound she heard from that house was the quiet thunk of the front door closing behind her.
No scouts. No slam doors.
No begging or chasing down the driveway. Just the click of the lock turning, like punctuation on a story long overdue for its ending. Emily didn't take much with her. One suitcase half full. A coat. Her passport. Her laptop. A folder of old music sheets. A faded Polaroid of her mother and father in front of the piano from when she was a girl, both smiling in a way she hadn't seen in years. Everything else she left behind. The wedding ring sat neatly in a bowl near the sink, next to the lavender soap she always used, but Daniel never noticed. The gifts, the clothes, the designer bags she never asked for, all of it stayed. She didn't want reminders. She didn't want compensation. She wanted space. She wanted silence she could breathe in instead of drown in. And most of all, she wanted her dignity. Intact. Untouched. When the Uber pulled up to the curb, the driver offered to help with her bag. She shook her head, placed it in the trunk herself, and climbed into the back seat. The morning sun slanted through the window, lighting her face in fractured gold. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the night of the Christmas dinner. Her tears had dried up, not from bitterness, but from clarity. Her friend Allison opened the door before she even rang the bell. "Oh my God," Allison whispered, pulling her into a hug that didn't ask for an explanation. Emily hadn't planned what to say. She just handed over the suitcase, stepped into the tiny Brooklyn apartment, and exhaled like she was letting go of 10 years all at once. For the next few days, Emily barely spoke. Not out of depression, but out of fatigue. Everything inside her had been stretched and strained and finally snapped. Her voice needed rest, not her singing voice, but the voice inside that told her who she was. She slept on Allison's couch, drank chamomile tea, and watched reruns of The Golden Girls. Simple, quiet, healing things. One afternoon, while cleaning out her inbox, she noticed an email from Daniel's attorney. It was short, cold, clinical. Pre-request, no contest. No claims to assets. Attached are finalized papers. There was no message from Daniel himself. No note. No question.
No oublié.
For a moment, she stared at the screen, not in sadness, but almost in disbelief, at how quickly a marriage could vanish in paperwork.
She signed, scanned,
clicked send, and just like that, it was over. It had ended not in a fight, but in paperwork and silence. A love that had once felt like a sunrise now disappeared like fog. A week later, Emily found herself in front of an old storefront in Williamsburg with a faded sign that read, Juniper Studios, recording and voice work. The building looked small, unassuming. But Allison had a connection there, a friend of a friend who managed voiceover talent and let aspiring artists help with administrative work in exchange for time in the studio. Just to try again, Allison said. Even if you don't do anything serious, just reconnect. Emily hadn't stood inside a studio in nearly a decade. Not since she'd sung backup vocals in college for an indie band that never made it past dive bars and SoundCloud. Now, standing inside Juniper Studios with bare walls, secondhand gear, and the smell of old leather couches, something inside her stirred. Not the desire for fame or validation, but something deeper. The quiet question, Could I still belong to myself? She started working there part-time, checking bookings, cleaning mics, scheduling auditions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a world that spoke her language. Late at night, when the rooms were empty and the city outside had quieted, she would sit at the piano and press a single key. Then another. Then a chord. Then she sang. Tentatively at first. Barely more than a hum. But slowly, her voice began to return to her. Not like a flood, but like rainfall. Gentle. Persistent.
Cleansing.
She started recording small demos, just for herself. Covers of songs she'd loved as a girl. Her voice had changed. It was huskier now, a little older, a little sadder. But also stronger. Grounded.
Lived in.
One night, Allison walked in while she was recording and just stood in the doorway, eyes wide. "You've been hiding that this whole time?" she said. Emily laughed softly. "I wasn't hiding. I just forgot it was there." Allison pulled out her phone. "I'm live streaming the next one. People need to hear this." "No way," Emily said. But she didn't stop her either. Because for the first time in a long, long time, Emily wasn't afraid of being seen. And in that cracked, forgotten studio, under flickering lights and decades-old wiring, she began, quietly, uncertainly, to rebuild herself. Not as someone's wife. Not as someone's daughter-in-law. Just as Emily. The thing about beginnings is that you often don't recognize them until much later. To Emily, it was just another Tuesday night. Rain had been tapping against the studio windows all evening, the kind of soft, persistent drizzle that made the city feel quieter than usual. She was alone at Juniper Studios, cleaning up after a last-minute cancellation. The other engineers had gone home early. Even Allison had texted that she'd be late, some work emergency, and a missed train. Emily didn't mind. She liked the stillness. There was something sacred about being alone in a room designed for sound. She sat down at the old upright piano in Studio B, cracked her knuckles, and pressed a few keys. The tone was a little off, one note slightly sharp, but it didn't matter. She let her hands wander. Then she began to sing. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even a full song. Just a thread of melody she used to hum in her dorm room years ago. Her voice floated up, low and smoky, filling the room like incense. She didn't belt. She didn't perform. She simply remembered. It was the sound of someone who had lived through something and come out quieter, but deeper. And she didn't know it, but someone else was listening. Allison had just arrived, soaked from the rain, and peeked into the studio to find Emily hunched over the piano. She didn't say anything, just pulled out her phone, opened Instagram, and hit go live. What happened next wasn't viral. Not instantly. Not in the cinematic way movies tend to portray. But it was real. Dozens of her followers tuned in. Then a few hundred. Then someone screen recorded the clip and uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "How is she not famous?" Within 3 days, the video had over 80,000 views. Within a week, it had been shared by a well-known vocal coach who called her voice a haunting mix of Norah Jones and Adele, with the weight of someone who's survived something. And then came the messages. Small indie producers. A few local booking agents. An unsigned label based in Philadelphia that wanted to talk. An invitation to perform at a speakeasy-style acoustic night downtown. Emily was stunned. "This can't be real," she whispered to Allison one night, scrolling through emails on her cracked phone screen. "Babe," Allison said, grinning, "you are real. They're just finally noticing." It wasn't the attention that overwhelmed Emily. It was the fact that something she had buried so deep, her voice, her music, herself, was being unearthed not as a relic, but as something valuable. She hesitated before accepting anything. For days, she wrestled with fear. What if it was a fluke? What if I'm too old, too late, too nothing? But those fears began to crack under the weight of something stronger. Curiosity. What if she wasn't? Her first performance was at a cafe in the East Village. Nothing fancy. String lights, folding chairs, and a mic that buzzed slightly. But when she stepped onto that small wooden stage, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt present. She sang one original song, just one. A slow, aching ballad about walking away from a love that never made room for her. The room went silent halfway through. Not politely, not stiffly, stunned silent. Someone in the back wiped their eyes. Another started recording. When she finished, no one clapped at first. It was as if they didn't want to break the spell. Then came the applause. From finally being seen for something that was hers alone. Not as a wife. Not as a disappointment. Not as a liability. Just Emily. Just a woman with a voice. One that people were beginning to remember. And for the first time in a long, long time, she was beginning to remember it too. 6 months after that first performance in the East Village Cafe, Emily Carter found herself seated across from a journalist at a brunch spot in Soho. White-tiled walls, rose-gold cutlery, oat milk in tiny glass pitchers. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jules from an indie music magazine, tapped a recorder and leaned in. "So, Emily," she said, "how does it feel to be the most surprising new voice of the year?" Emily stirred her tea. "I guess I don't really think of it like that," she said with a soft smile. "It just feels like I finally stopped hiding." It was true. She hadn't set out to become famous. She wasn't chasing chart positions or stadium tours. But something about her voice, its texture, its restraint, its emotional depth, had struck a chord. People weren't just listening. They were connecting. Cole, the producer from the cafe show, had kept his promise. He helped her record a 5-track EP called Ashes and Honey. It was released quietly, independently, no label fanfare, no PR machine. But within a week, it had racked up thousands of streams. The title track, a stripped-down piano ballad about loving someone who never made space for you, became a favorite on late-night radio and breakup playlists. Reviews came in slowly at first. Then more quickly. One blogger wrote, "Emily Carter doesn't shout to be heard. She just sings so honestly that you lean in." Another review called her voice the sound of healing. She wasn't just a good singer. She was a story. And stories, people love stories. The attention surprised her, but what surprised her more was how grounded she felt in the middle of it. There were photo shoots, mostly casual, often barefoot in studio light. There were interviews where people asked her about the past, and she gave them what she wanted to share, no more. She didn't talk about Daniel. She didn't need to. Her music said everything. But the world is small, and fame has a way of circling back to the places we tried to escape. One afternoon, while walking out of a recording session, Emily glanced down at her phone and saw a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Saw you in Rolling Stone.
Didn't know you could sing like that.
Hope you're doing well. Daniel." She stared at the screen for a full minute before locking the phone and sliding it into her bag. That night, she received a friend request on Instagram from Victoria Carter, his mother. The caption under her latest photo was, "Grateful for second chances and the courage to begin again." Victoria had left a comment. "Beautiful. So proud of the woman you've become." Emily deleted it without replying. Despite her rising visibility, Emily kept her life simple. She still lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. She still cleaned the studio on Sundays. She still walked to the corner cafe every morning for the same chai latte. But she was no longer invisible. People recognized her now. A woman on the subway once tapped her shoulder and said, "Your song got me through my divorce." A college student DM'd her, "Thank you for making me feel seen." It wasn't ego that fed her. It was connection. It was the quiet reassurance that maybe all those years of being overlooked weren't a waste, but a furnace. A place she'd been forged, not broken. One evening, she was invited to sing at a charity gala, a black tie event hosted by a philanthropic tech mogul with deep ties to the music industry. It would be the most public stage she'd stood on so far. High-profile guests, press coverage, cameras. Emily hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that," she said to Cole during rehearsal. "You are," he replied, without blinking. "They're not doing you a favor by inviting you. You're bringing them something real." So she accepted. The night of the gala, Emily walked into the ballroom in a floor-length ivory dress, simple, elegant, untouched by trend. Her hair was loose, her lips bare. She didn't try to look like a star. She just looked like herself. As she took the stage, the lights warmed her skin. The crowd quieted. And somewhere near the back of the room, a pair of familiar eyes watched her from the shadows. Daniel. Emily saw him. She met his gaze for a breath. Then she turned to the mic and sang. Not to prove anything. Not to reclaim power. But because this moment was hers. By the time the final note faded, the applause had already started. This time, no one could ignore her. The ballroom at the Delacroix Hotel shimmered in gold and champagne light, the chandeliers above reflecting off 1,000 flutes of Prosecco. Laughter and string music floated through the air like perfume. It was a night curated to impress. Curated guest lists, curated menus, curated reputations. Emily Carter stepped out of the black car and into the soft thrum of flash photography. It had been barely a year since the world started noticing her voice. But tonight, she wasn't just the quiet indie breakout anymore. She was the keynote performer for a high-profile benefit gala, hosted by Logan Jameson, a tech entrepreneur turned philanthropist whose clean energy startup had recently made headlines nationwide. Logan, it turned out, was also an old friend of Cole's and a longtime fan of her music. "You've been on my playlist for months," he'd said when they first met backstage at a studio launch. "What you're doing, it's not just music. It's emotional architecture." She didn't know if that was a line or if he actually meant it. But Logan had a way of speaking that felt respectful, not performative, not romanticized, just real. So when he invited her to perform at his gala, she said yes. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was who else had been invited. Emily arrived alone. She didn't need an entourage. Didn't want one. Her long black gown fell in soft, clean lines, hugging her figure without screaming for attention. Her makeup was minimal. Her hair was pulled back into a loose, confident bun. She didn't look like someone playing dress-up. She looked like someone who belonged. As she stepped into the grand foyer, the noise dimmed for just a moment. Heads turned. Conversations paused. It wasn't just that people recognized her, it was the contrast. The woman who had once seemed to whisper through every room now walked like she owned the floor beneath her heels. "Is that?" Someone whispered. "Yes, that's Emily Carter. She's performing tonight. I thought she was a housewife or something." She was. She moved toward the stage area, weaving between tables, offering quiet nods and small smiles. She was used to attention now, but still careful with it, never flaunting, never retreating. Just present. Then she saw them. At a table near the center of the ballroom, marked Carter Technologies, sat Daniel. And next to him, his parents. Victoria Carter, in a sequined emerald dress, was sipping white wine and scanning the room like royalty, surveying her court. When her eyes landed on Emily, her expression didn't falter, but her grip on the glass tightened. Daniel stood up. "Emily," he said, approaching with a forced smile.
Wow.
"You look—" She didn't let him finish. "Good evening, Daniel," she said evenly, not slowing her stride. He followed. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I was invited." He looked down. "I've been listening to your music. It's powerful."
Thank you, she said.
No warmth. No bitterness. Just calm. "I was hoping we could talk. Maybe catch up?" he asked, stepping closer. She stopped. Turned. Looked him in the eye. "Daniel, whatever you're searching for in me, it's gone. You didn't lose me. You left me behind." Before he could reply, Logan appeared beside her. "Emily," he said gently. "They're ready for your sound check." Daniel's eyes flickered, recognition, surprise, something like jealousy. Logan offered his hand to Emily. She took it. They walked away, without looking back. The performance was scheduled just after dinner. Emily stood backstage, breathing deeply. Not out of nerves, those had faded months ago, but out of reverence. She still believed music deserved ceremony, no matter the room or the audience. As she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell. Logan introduced her briefly, his words simple but genuine. Then she sat at the grand piano and placed her fingers on the keys. Her voice rose, rich, deep, and raw. She didn't sing a power anthem. She didn't need theatrics. Instead, she sang the leaving kind, a song she'd written about walking away from someone who never stood up for her. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't have to. The lyrics carried everything she never said aloud. You asked me to shrink so your name could shine slash. But even a shadow knows it's still a line. The applause at the end was long, earnest. The kind that doesn't explode, it builds slow and certain like respect settling into a room. Emily stood, nodded, smiled, and as she walked off stage, she passed Daniel's table again. This time, he didn't stand. This time he looked small. The morning after the gala, Emily's performance was trending on Twitter. Clips of her song circulated with captions like, "Poetry in pain. That's how you reclaim your voice," and "She didn't perform. She revealed." The praise was organic, unforced. Not hyped by PR teams or bot followers, just real people moved by something honest. Emily woke to hundreds of messages from fans, fellow musicians, even distant relatives who hadn't reached out in years. Her Spotify numbers tripled overnight. And yet, when she checked her notifications, there was one comment that pierced through it all like glass. Posted under a video clip of her gala performance from a now-deleted account. Funny how everyone celebrates a woman who can't even give a man a child. Her stomach dropped. Then more appeared, this time from multiple usernames. She looks glamorous now, but she's just a barren shell. Ask her ex-husband why she's really single. Infertile fraud. It didn't take long to trace the IPs. Cole had someone on his team look into it. And it led right back to Carter Technologies' internal network, 3 different accounts, all tied to Victoria Carter's assistant. The intent was clear: discredit Emily, undermine her, reduce her brilliance to a womb they assumed was empty. But what they didn't know, what they never thought would come back to them, was the one fact they had always buried. Emily was not the one who was infertile. She never had been. "You have every right to defend yourself," Logan said, pacing the rooftop of his Soho loft where they'd gathered that evening. "We could go public. I can get my team to contact the right media." Emily sat on a bench, the city skyline stretching behind her. Her fingers curled around a cup of tea. "I never wanted to out him," she said quietly. "Even now, I don't want to win that way." "It's not about winning," Cole said from the corner. "It's about truth. It's about showing people that they don't get to shame you for something that was never your shame to carry." Emily looked up. Her eyes were calm, but focused, like something old had awakened inside her, not rage, but resolve. She nodded once. "Then let's do it. But I'm not giving them what they expect."
No tabloid scandal.
No shouting match. "What are you thinking?" Logan asked. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "we let them bury themselves. I'll tell the truth.
In my own way.
On my stage." 3 nights later, Emily returned to the Delacroix, this time not for someone else's event, but her own. It was a private showcase, invitation only, curated for producers, media, and a few industry allies. Logan sponsored the night. Cole handled sound. And Emily? She chose every song. Every word. Every pause. Unsurprisingly, Carter Technologies had RSVP'd. Daniel would be there. Victoria, too. Emily didn't flinch. She stepped onto the stage in a white satin pantsuit. Elegant, commanding, nothing soft. No more gowns. No more quiet retreat. Her voice rose again, but this time, not in melody. Before the first note played, she addressed the room. "There's been a lot said about me lately. About what I can or cannot do. About what makes a woman worthy." The room stilled. "I carried his shame as if it were mine. I absorbed every whisper, every insult. But that ends tonight." Gasps echoed from the center table. Victoria pale, Daniel frozen. Emily continued. "No woman should be measured by her ability to bear children. And no man should be allowed to weaponize her silence." And then, without breaking eye contact, she turned toward the piano. And she sang. The song, titled Inheritance, was a haunting, slow-building piece. Not about motherhood. but about legacy, about what we pass on when we choose silence, and what we reclaim when we speak. When the last chord faded, no one moved. Then Logan stood. "Before we wrap this beautiful night, I want to make something clear," he said, stepping forward. "Anyone who seeks to shame, harass, or discredit this woman moving forward will find themselves disinvited from every business table I sit at." He turned to Daniel's table. "Effective immediately. My company will no longer be working with Carter Technologies in any capacity." The sound of 100 forks dropping was louder than applause. Emily stood beside him, calm and upright. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply said, "Truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be heard." And then she walked off stage. Behind her, the world was shifting. The press wanted a statement. Of course they did. After her performance and the public revelation of the truth about Daniel's infertility, Emily received no fewer than 17 requests from major media outlets, television interviews, magazine exclusives, tell-all memoir offers. She declined every one, not out of fear, not even from exhaustion, but because she had already said everything she needed to say, in a room full of people who once looked through her. That was enough. Emily didn't want to become a symbol of scandal. She didn't want her story reduced to a headline. What she had fought for wasn't revenge. It was release. She took the following week off. No shows. No interviews. No studio work. Instead, she left the city and stayed in a borrowed cabin near the Catskills. Just her, a fireplace, a pile of books, and the winter silence that wrapped around the hills like a wool blanket. There she cooked simple meals, read poetry again, took long walks where no one knew her name. Some nights, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness. Not quite. But peace. The kind that comes not from things going right, but from surviving what went wrong. Meanwhile, in the world she left behind, everything stirred. Carter Technologies scrambled to do damage control. Daniel's father tried to reach out through mutual contacts, offering carefully crafted apologies. Victoria Carter posted a vague public letter laced with the words misunderstanding, regret, and privacy. Emily didn't reply. Daniel sent flowers. Twice. Then an email. Then a letter. She never opened it. There was nothing left to read. Nothing left to salvage. She knew what he wanted, not her back, but his reflection. The woman he'd once dismissed had become a mirror, showing him everything he'd chosen not to be. And that truth was harder to face than her absence. Let him sit with it. Back in the city, her absence was felt in other ways. Venues called asking when she'd return. Fans left handwritten letters at the studio door. Even Logan reached out gently. No pressure. Just letting you know the world misses your voice. She wrote back, "I don't miss the world, but I think I miss the music." And so, little by little, she returned. Not to the spotlight, but to herself. She began working on a new album.
No timeline.
No commercial pressure. Just her, Cole, a few trusted musicians, and a studio filled with sunlight and honesty. She titled the project Stillness Speaks. Because it did. Because it was. One evening, as she left the studio, she passed a street musician singing her first single, Ashes and Honey. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, just strumming his guitar with his eyes closed, playing the song like it belonged to him now too. She smiled. That was all she ever wanted, not fame, not power. Just to be felt. To be remembered in the quiet lives of strangers. Later that night, at home, Emily looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't see a star. She didn't see a victim. She didn't even see a survivor. She saw a woman who had walked alone and didn't fall apart. A woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, silenced, and still found a way to sing. Not to shout. Not to prove. But because her voice was hers again. And that was the kind of victory no one could take away. Spring arrived like a soft confession, tentative, almost shy. Trees began to stretch again. The sky lingered longer before giving in to night. And somewhere in a modest Brooklyn studio, Emily Carter was humming. Not rehearsing. Not writing. just humming. It was a Tuesday morning. The windows were cracked open, letting in the smell of rain on concrete. Sunlight touched the floor like it was apologizing for being gone so long. Cole was mixing a new track, hunched over a console with his usual intensity. Logan was seated in the back, sipping coffee and listening quietly, his eyes occasionally drifting toward her. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a notebook filled with half-lyrics, voice memos, and ideas scribbled in the middle of the night. She was in no rush. The pressure to prove herself had faded. The world had already heard her. Now she was writing not for others, but for herself. In the months since the Carter Technologies scandal had died down, Emily had found something rare: freedom. She'd bought a small brownstone with a sunroom that became her sanctuary. She taught weekend songwriting classes to teen girls. She visited her mother more. She started cooking again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And slowly, quietly, she let Logan in. He never forced it. He never treated her like someone who needed fixing. He showed up, consistently, respectfully, patiently. There were no grand declarations. No "you complete me" moments. Just small, everyday things. Walking her dog after a late recording session. Making her tea, without asking. Sending her voice notes with poems he found in old books. Watching the way she cradled a melody in rehearsal, like it was something sacred. One night, he said, "You don't have to choose between being strong and being loved. The right person will never ask you to." She didn't respond right away. But later, when they stood in her kitchen and she reached across the counter to rest her fingers on his hand, she realized she already had. They kept it quiet. Not secret, just sacred. The tabloids had speculated, of course. But Emily had learned the value of boundaries. This time, her life wasn't content. It was hers. And Logan understood that. When he traveled for work, she didn't feel abandoned. When she needed space, he didn't question it. When she succeeded, he celebrated without needing to be seen beside her. They were two whole people meeting, not filling. On the anniversary of her first performance, Emily held a private concert in the same East Village cafe where it all began.
No cameras. No livestream.
Just 100 people who had walked beside her journey, whether in person or in heart. She opened the show with a cover of an old jazz standard, then moved into her own material, songs from Ashes and Honey, Inheritance, and the upcoming album Stillness Speaks. But it was the final song that changed the room. A new piece. Never recorded. Never shared. Just piano and voice. It was a love song, but not in the traditional sense. Not about another person. It was about home, the kind she had built inside herself. I am not waiting in the doorway anymore. I have walked through. I have made tea. I have learned to sing with no one watching. And now, if you knock, I will open. But not because I need saving. Only because I want to share the quiet. When she finished, the room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, there was a long, reverent silence. The kind you don't break. Because breaking it would feel like waking up from a dream. And then, a single clap. Then two. And finally, a standing ovation that rose not in frenzy, but in warmth. Logan stood in the back, hands in his pockets, smiling softly. He didn't rush forward. He didn't try to claim the moment. He simply nodded. She nodded back. Later that night, they walked home hand in hand. Not as a power couple. Not as a headline. Just two people, walking quietly beneath spring blossoms, past windows glowing with life. Emily looked up at the stars, small, scattered, stubborn in the city sky, and thought, this is not the life I dreamed of. It's better. Because I made it. Because I stayed. Because I finally chose me. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't searching for a happy ending. She was simply living in one.